Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Business Support Series webinar on commercial leases in a post-pandemic world. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Josh Creighton, the Community Engagement Specialist here with the HALIFAX Chamber, and your host for this morning. Commercial space leasing is the second biggest line item for most businesses in retail, office, or industrial worlds. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us have found our office to be empty and underutilized. Today, Cushman and Wakefield Atlantic are here to share their tips and tricks so that you can start to get the best out of your commercial lease again. Thank you everyone who submitted questions for the presenter. When we get to the Q&A, feel free to type any other questions into the chat box. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, James Collins, Associate Vice President of Cushman and Wakefield Atlantic. Before entering the real estate industry, James founded a successful PR agency that served over 3,500 clients around the world, including the Reagan presidential family, the Kardashians, national airlines, and the UK government. Wow. James now uses real estate as a tool to solve his clients' most pressing business issues. James works with each client to cut to the core of their biggest challenges and finds a way for real estate to provide a solution. Welcome, James, and thank you for joining us today. I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks, Josh. Thanks to everyone jumping on. I'm just going to get my screen shared here. Get the presentation up, bear with me here. Okay, just gonna give me a thumbs up there, Josh, if you can see that. Presentation good? Yep, perfect, I've got that. Okay, I am actually going to just get rid of myself for the next short while here, just so you can stare at the presentation and not me. So yeah, I'm James Collins, Associate Vice President with Cushman Wakefield Atlantic, and here's our topic today: getting the best out of your commercial lease in a post-pandemic world. So it's going to be a very general, broad overview, trying to distill what can often be quite a complex topic. So we're going to dive right in. I think we're going to run about 45 minutes. So we should have plenty of time at the end for questions. So here's what you're going to learn: why your commercial lease and the leasing process is now more complex than ever. Look, the pandemic has changed the game. So we're going to look at what's changed since 2020 and the specific new rules that you need to play along with to ensure that your lease is affordable, flexible, and designed around strategy, not experimentation. Experimentation is great, it's wonderful, but it's not something we want to do a whole lot of in the leasing game. See, getting a good deal no longer means getting the cheapest rent. We're going to discuss why and how many aspects of commercial leasing have actually recently, since the pandemic, been turned on their heads. And why does it matter? Well, the strategies that you were using in 2018, 2019, they likely no longer work because, as I put there, the old rules of finding a space and negotiating a lease no longer apply. And it's this conundrum that leasing requires you to lock into a contract, to lock into terms, often for many, many years, but you're having to do this while the business is still recovering and still adapting. So it begs that question: how do you work flexibility into your lease? Super important, because leasing just isn't cheap. It remains the largest expense for most businesses after staffing. So you can still find efficiencies. You can still find savings. We're going to go in this presentation a little bit into to what you can do. You just can't afford to miss them. And the other reason it's vitally important is because landlords now operate very differently. And you're in a relationship with a landlord. I often say it's like a marriage, with the lease being the marriage contract or the prenup. As those landlords adapt, tenants must adapt too. And we all know the phrase adapt or die. It's not that dramatic, but how your lease is structured essentially can make or break your business. So we'll take a quick look at who we are at Cushman Wakefield Atlantic, just to give you guys some background and some context. So we would be considered one of the largest full-service commercial real estate brokerages in Atlantic Canada. We have 19 professionals. We have boots on the ground in every single Atlantic province. We're fairly high transaction, around 250 a year, and we provide comprehensive services, as the fourth bullet point says there: buy, sell, list, and lease services to clientele across Atlantic Canada. You probably have seen our signs. If you don't think you've seen our signs, you definitely have. We're very, very lucky because we are proudly local, but we have the ability to plug in to Cushman Wakefield nationally and globally, which allows us to provide a consistent experience to our clients. So we often run files for national global companies who might be working with our team in Austin. They could be working with the team in Beijing. They have a little office out here in Halifax. And when they engage with our office, we're able just to provide that consistent experience, from the way our emails look to the processes that we follow, our ability to adopt their processes. So yes, we're very, very local, but we can plug into Cushman across the globe. I'm going to chat a little bit about our company service lines in Canada, but I just want to give you some quick stats on Cushman Wakefield globally. We're an old, long-established company, founded in 1917, currently headquartered in the Windy City of Chicago, and we're very large, about 50,000 of us in 400 offices in 60 countries. So we're a major player in terms of commercial real estate services. We would be considered one of the big three firms, although I'm not going to say the names of the other two. And this breakdown here, it looks at not everything, but our major service lines across Canada. So on the left, we've got brokerage, Cushman Wakefield Atlantic. That's my world. That's where I operate. To the left of that, we have asset services. So these guys manage properties on behalf of owners. You'll likely know their signs from Burnside. They manage a couple of local malls. They're not us in any way. We are not related to them. We're a brokerage. We don't manage property. We don't own property. They manage. So the great thing here is it allows us to do deals with Cushman & Wakefield asset services, managed properties with zero conflict. And then on the left, we've got two other important service lines in Canada: valuation division and equity debt and structured finance. But I want to take your attention back to the left, because again, that's us. We are the brokerage. So some people call us commercial real estate agents, commercial real estate advisors. If we were down in the US, they would probably adopt the term broker. But essentially, we provide agency representation to tenants, buyers, owners, and sellers. So it boils down to, if someone wants to lease space, they want to buy a commercial property, sell a commercial property, if they're a tenant looking to find space, or if they're looking to renew a lease, then we can step in and we can facilitate that process in their best interest. So we would just be working with one side of that deal and representing them on an exclusive basis. Just have a look at some of the guys we've worked with in the past. This is, of course, always evolving, and we've definitely worked across the spectrum of client sizes and industries, from global Fortune 500s occupying hundreds of thousands of square feet, all the way down to local mom and pop businesses locally that occupy just a few hundred square feet. And again, it's that ability to proudly be local and to be a local team who also have that national and global reach. So that's just a couple of the folks that we've worked with. Going to burn through myself. I'm probably the least important and least exciting thing that we're going to discuss today. James Collins. I'm originally from Wales in the UK. Started my first business about 15 years ago and joined Cushman & Wakefield in 2016. So my practice area is industrial and suburban office. Burnside would be the main industrial world that I operate in. And then on the office side would be Dartmouth, Bedford, and suburban Halifax. So I've not been doing this 35 years. I've been around the block, though. I've been doing it for a few years. I'm about 300 deals in, probably about $150 million of total transaction value. Yeah, and on the bottom is that typical line we have to put: born again fitness addict, news junkie, husband, dog dad, pilot. So we're just going to move on. I want to start by looking at some key leasing trends in the area. So before we look at strategy, it's really important that we back that up with some context. And we're going to take a look at office and industrial. So give you guys some pretty easy graphics here, so we're not bogging everyone down first thing on Tuesday morning. Let's look at office trends. So this would account for all classes of office space, and it would be split between the markets of the CBD, suburban Halifax, Dartmouth, and Bedford. So to keep it really easy, overall, office vacancies have trended downwards over the last 12 months. There's been positive activity in downtown Halifax and Dartmouth. We have seen suburban Halifax and Bedford with a slight increase in vacancies during this period. But overall, if we look at the market, then those vacancies are trending downwards. The number on top, the vacancy rate, is probably the most important one. The one on the bottom, asking rent, would be the second. So let's take a look at pricing for the office market. Rents are up on average only slightly, but they are trending upwards. Bedford would have seen the largest increase of late, up around 44 cents quarter on quarter of 2021. And of course, as you'll know, vacancy rates and asking rent are tied together, and we can represent both of these graphically. So our blue bars there would be gross asking rent. Our green line would be the vacancy rate. If we represent these, it maybe doesn't look like you thought it would in the face of a pandemic. During the period from 2020 to today, vacancies are down, rents are up. So we can conclude from this essentially that the office market remains buoyant. And of course, off the back of that, landlords are still able to negotiate from a fairly strong position. And this isn't opinion. Here, we're just looking at the data and we're letting the data do the talking. So that's the Coles notes on the office market. We're going to jump over to industrial, which has gone crazy. Halifax's industrial market replicates industrial markets right now across North America. If you operate in this world, you'll know about it. If you know me, I can't stop talking about it. Vacancies continue to plummet, rents continue to rise. Many things are driving this, but it predominantly, if we kind of condense it down, e-commerce, it's the online shopping boom that occurred during the pandemic. It's also users looking to expand local storage after they uncovered supply chain inefficiencies during COVID. So to put that in real terms, Burnside's filling fast. It's going to continue to fill. And new developments are struggling to come online at the speed that tenants demand. We don't see any sign of this slowing down either. So it's definitely been a change for us and something we've had to do a lot of adapting with and a lot of learning in the last couple of years. So what we can do, let's take that vacancy rate on top. Let's take that asking rent on the bottom. Let's represent those graphically like we did with the office market. You can see there it's a bit more dramatic. You can see where they intersect. It really is just an amplified and more aggressive version of what's happening in the office market. But the key takeaway here is HRM is now a serious player. It's now a serious economic market. And as our population continues to increase, office and industrial space is going to probably continue to fill, and those prices are going to continue to rise. And the key takeaway here for me as someone who represents clients in all manner of deals is the understanding and the acceptance, even if they don't want to hear it, that landlords have really not struggled during the pandemic and probably not struggled to the level that many tenants think they have. So that's our quick overview on what the markets are doing. And now let's take a look at some key challenges that tenants face. So these are going to be the questions that we're going to attempt to answer over the rest of the presentation. So the first one is how to adapt space to support work from home and return to work. The bottom line is many occupiers are still figuring out what future working cultures and return to office timelines look like. A survey done in the US last year reported, this surprised me, just 12% of employees want to work from home full time. If you remember looking at your LinkedIn and Twitter feed when employers were sending people home at the start of the pandemic, everyone was thrilled. The bottom line now, 2 years later, is people miss human interaction. They miss meeting face to face. So the question becomes, how do tenants plan their space, particularly with a pending renewal that's going to require them to make those hard decisions and lock in, when they're still planning when their employees are going to return to the office and how they're going to be working moving forward? So if we go down to the next point then, does that justify less space? There's more questions here to consider, more questions here that we'll attempt to answer, such as, if staff are working in rotation, how do you right size your unit for an average human load, say, of 60% of the total workforce? And if your business took a financial hit during the pandemic, do you or your ego require a huge corner office that's 5 times bigger than it needs to be when you're only in it for 1.5 days a week? And is there scope maybe for a smaller central office with options for your workforce to access small, flexible co-working options near a home? Another challenge is they've been a saving grace for us to some degree, the pandemic era technology advancements, but that's completely changed demands for space. So if you're now holding 90% of your meetings on Zoom, saving you a lot of money. So do you need to spend $15,000 of rent a year on a 500 square foot boardroom? And do you need those 3 breakout rooms when your staff are now keeping in touch through Teams and Slack and tools like that? And something I've seen a lot of, people have digitized 30 years worth of files so they can access them remotely during COVID. So do you need that 300 square foot file storage room anymore? I've enjoyed visiting clients before the pandemic and post-pandemic, and they've always opened up the door very quickly. It's like the messy bedroom everyone has at home, and they've quickly closed it on their room that's just busting with files. Well, that room is often now empty. So, can that space be deemed redundant? The big question below, the big challenge, how do tenants keep rents low and lease terms flexible? So many companies have downsized, of course, and felt the strain during the recession, but how do they now keep costs down? Do current market conditions justify lower rent expectations from tenants like this? And what do good deals look like today, and how can they make their case to obtain it? Another question is, with lease terms, can these people that have struggled, can they commit to 3 or 5 years with uncertainty in their industry's market? And how are those space demands adjusting with potential fears, say, over future public health and geopolitical restrictions? And ironically, since I put some notes together for this presentation a couple of weeks ago, we have seen the geopolitical landscape change very dramatically. And let's consider as well what would happen if we had another pandemic. So if you desire a shorter lease term, then how do you get one without paying a rental premium? And how do you snag that term and still enjoy landlord inducements? It's all food for thought. And finally, big, huge challenge, and there's probably questions on this, we're going to address it too, is what lease clauses might landlords want to introduce these days? Which ones should you push to have included? So which ones do the landlords want that are useful to you? Which ones do you want to suggest that are useful to the landlord? And then which ones really only serve one side? These are all things to consider. The bottom in red is that pressing question. How do you do everything above and still factor in potential growth during your lease term? This is the question I get most often, because we've discussed a lot about justifying less space, but many companies are still thriving. So how can they right size for their adapting work schedules and the adoption of new technologies, but then still have the option to take more space as they grow? Are they forced to take more space now that's not required in case they need it down the road? So how can these folks only lease what they need now and take on more space during their lease term without being boxed in, say, by a landlord who doesn't have any larger spaces? So let's start answering these. Firstly, we're going to look at adapting space for uncertain or flexible future work schedules. And it comes down to a number of things, but one service that we've been using an awful lot recently is the service of a good space planner, because thorough culture-led space planning has become vital to ensure that your unit can function in this post-pandemic world. It's going to make sure your space can be used by every employee when they're present in the new ways that they're working. So a good space planner is going to drill into your company's specific work patterns, cultures, schedules, and then design a space that's going to fit and live and breathe around you day to day. I've seen these planners do amazing work. They've transformed clunky, pre-pandemic, awkward, rigid office spaces into spaces that live and breathe around the workforce, often changing and reconfiguring daily as that workforce is changing. So your landlords, they know that you need to adapt. They know your old unit likely doesn't work. So you need to make culture-driven, not just space planning, but culture-driven space planning a non-negotiable landlord expense at your next renewal. And here's some steps I've included for kind of how to do that. It's not comprehensive, but this is definitely a great starting point. The one thing you're going to need is time. So 6 months to go through this process. A good space planner is going to want to drill into how you guys work every day, how people move around the office, how they interact with each other. So you need to leave enough time for this study to take place. Work with that planner, have them produce some floor plan options, ideally in CAD format, which can then be sent to your landlord, and subsequently can be sent to a contractor to allow them to price up doing those leasehold improvements and the refit and the renos ready for your next lease. I've had great success making this a non-negotiable inclusion in any renewal. So I would definitely advise anybody to push their landlord to bring a space planner in and to do it at the landlord's expense. But the landlords are in a good position these days, but they will still fight to retain a tenant, and this is a good little way to do that. So we're not going to dwell on the next one for too long, but it's a question that kind of flows off this is, if space is changing, how much space does every employee need? And it's interesting because over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, workplaces and anyone operating in an office at this time will know they shifted very much to the open plan with a higher density of bodies. This saw the average amount of square footage allocated to each employee pretty much cut in half. Look there, year 2000, people are enjoying 325 square feet. That's bigger than most apartments in New York City. That's come down to like 75 to 150 square feet. But the pandemic has halted this trend and it's slightly reversed it. And it's due to many things like ongoing and future physical distancing requirements, the psychological effect of the pandemic on employees, and also decreased physical interactions, which now result in people wanting to have more breathing space. So we say it's reversed the trend. It's not done it by too much. 150 to 175 is roughly what we see people budgeting right now per employee, and take into account that this factors in a proportionate share of common areas, things like breakout rooms, meeting spaces, lunchrooms, and things like that. So let's move on to a point that we discussed in that challenges section, which is if you need less space now, how do you grow in the future? Because there really is a juggle to be played as a tenant. How do you lease the least amount of space right now that you need to function, therefore keeping costs down, but without boxing yourself in to prevent future growth? And it might lead you to ask, are you required to make space size decisions now and stomach them for your entire upcoming lease term? Are you required to think 5 years in the future and maybe take now the extra space that you might one day need and pay for it just in case it's needed later on? In most cases, the answer is thankfully no, because it is possible to right size your space at your next expiry or renewal and then grow before that lease term ends. Many tenants, another call we get in the brokerage all the time, is this challenge here, is that many tenants think in order to do this, they would need to break their lease and pay a penalty in order to move into a larger unit midterm. Or they might think that they're required to do something potentially even more, less cost effective, which is to take double the space now, speculatively, in case they want to grow. So here's the strategy for only leasing and paying for what you need right now, and then being able to grow without having to forfeit or default on your current lease. And it's fairly simple. It comes down to aligning yourself with a landlord who owns a large portfolio. And by this, in the Halifax market, let's say minimum 4 or 5 suitable buildings, because these are the landlords who will provide true flexibility for growth, something very vital to almost all tenants as they recover from the pandemic. So let's go through the steps on leasing only what you need right now while retaining the option to grow only when you're ready. Relocate, if you're not already with one, to a landlord with multiple buildings in their portfolio. Lots of these in HRM. I am not here today. We are 100% impartial as a brokerage. We have no loyalty to any particular landlord in any way, shape, or form, so I'm not going to name names, except to say that there's plenty of them out there in HRM. And then you're going to want to lease a unit that's currently right-sized. So use that space planner to lease something that works for you right now. But here's the trick. When you get that offer to lease negotiated, get an expansion clause put in there that will allow you to trade up during the lease term. So essentially this means to move into a bigger unit. And the second trick is make sure you can, or work your very best to negotiate to have that expansion clause penalty free. The trade-off here is if a landlord agrees to allow you to trade up to a bigger unit mid-term for no penalty, they are likely or almost always going to ask you to sign a new lease term. So to put this in real terms, you've signed a 5-year lease on 1,000 square feet. In year 3, you decide you need 1,700 square feet. Okay, so you have that penalty-free expansion clause. The landlord is going to allow you to move at no cost. They are going to say to you at that point, you need to sign a fresh 5 years. And as a broker and as someone who negotiates daily with landlords, I think that's a pretty fair trade-off. And if you're already with a large landlord and you need to try this, then you can go ahead and try it now. Let's look at why a landlord with a large portfolio can make this easier. There are a better mix of unit sizes in their portfolio. So it's very common for larger landlords to have availabilities, floor plates, even with a few thousand square feet. You have some landlords with vacancies at 20,000 square feet, 10,000 square feet, and then just about everything in between, all the way down to 500 square feet. So there's just a higher chance of them having ongoing rolling vacancies, which means when you need to trade up, there's of course going to be more choice. Conversely, a lower risk of no larger units being available. And that's what we're trying to avoid here, is you needing to trade up and having to either jump the landlord's portfolio or be with a landlord that is a little bit bigger but doesn't have enough rolling vacancy that you need 1,700 square feet, but the only free unit they have is 5,000 square feet. It's just going to defeat the purpose of what we're doing here. Larger landlords, and this is subjective, but they typically can have smoother property management to facilitate this process. So you're just not going to catch them off guard. They're going to know what you're asking for when you're trying to negotiate the penalty-free expansion. They're going to know how they feel about it. And I would go out on a limb and say they're probably more likely to accept that at the negotiation phase. To say, underneath, it's definitely not impossible with a small landlord, but it's a little bit tougher. And you might need to call on sublease and assignment rights that are in most leases. Do be aware with those two, and this is, I'm not here to officially advise on these, but they do carry a little bit more risk. So an example would be if you need to grow and you have to jump the landlord's portfolio and you decide to take on a subtenant. Again, it's all down to how it's worded. Don't take this word as gospel, but likely you're going to remain responsible to pay the rent. If that subtenant defaults, you're likely to be responsible for damage that they do and any other defaults under the lease. So getting a subtenant or assigning the leases can be a great option. It can work. We actually help people with it pretty frequently, but there is some risk there as well. If you can go through alignment with a larger landlord and to negotiate that penalty-free expansion into the offer and subsequently into the lease, it's likely going to serve you a little bit better. And notice I'm deliberately using words like could do, likely sometimes, because everything is fluid in the world that I operate in, and everything is down to the landlord, down to the tenant, even down to the conditions of people's mood when we're negotiating that day. So there really are no hard and fast rules. It's actually would be very hard to write a book about how to do this, because there just really isn't any firm advice we can give, because everything is so open to negotiation. The literal million-dollar question next is, how do we keep rents low? Or how do you keep rents low and within budget? So just like Ron Burgundy, it's kind of a big deal post-pandemic, as if it wasn't before, but post-pandemic, the need to keep rents affordable never has been greater. However large or successful a business, the need to control rent remains a top priority. It's a way of bringing some ability to plan in the face of so many other uncertainties with the world that we're operating in today. Rents, as you all know, are almost always negotiable. And wait for some contradictions from me in this slide, but rents are almost always negotiable, whether you're relocating or renewing, or if you're new to market, but negotiable to a point. The majority of tenants just don't succeed in negotiating rent because of fatal flaws in their strategy. And it can make a difference. A small difference in the per square foot cost of space can make a massive difference on the bottom line of a business. Imagine if you rented 10,000 square feet. And you were able to negotiate $1.50 off the net rate. I mean, it really adds up. So you can't look at it in the vacuum of per square foot. But I want to stop here for a second, and this is where some of the contradictions I mentioned come in. But I couldn't really find a way to work this in without contradicting myself. We're talking that rent is vitally important, and I'm just telling you that per square foot costs can make a small difference to the overall bottom line of a business. But when clients tell me to go and get them the best deal, they're typically only ever referring to bringing the rent down. But here's the contradiction: that is not always the best strategy, because every time we ask a landlord for something, they're going to take something away from us. Look, when we go into a deal, the deal is in balance and every deal has a price, okay? It's very, very hard for us to bring that total price down. But what we can do is splice and dice a deal in many different ways. I have never in 300 deals done 2 deals in exactly the same way, okay? I would rather sometimes see a tenant not get the 25-cent discount that they were trying to negotiate for, if that means something like they can retain an early termination option in that lease, or if it means the landlord's going to give them some more cash for some vital improvements in the unit. So it really depends on what's important to your business, what's important to your business right now and in the future, the financial setup, the daily operations, everything. I just wanted to make the point that when you're trying to get the best deal, it does not always mean to grind the landlord on the rental rate. And let's face this hard truth, folks. Landlords have a strong position. The top one is the tough love. They're in the market daily. You're not. Landlords are like me. They watch, they work in, they research the local commercial real estate market like 40, 50, 60 hours a week, depending on how much of a workaholic they are. Because of that, they know all the competing properties and they know your suitability for them. They deliberately learn all of this to maintain that strong negotiating position. And off the back of this, they're going to have huge amounts of data. Like us in the brokerage, as I told you, we survey we survey hundreds of properties and we produce thousands of data points as a brokerage. Landlords do the same, and they're likely updating this and refreshing it every quarter. Landlords also have a strong position because they control paperwork. So you don't just like write a lease and give it to the landlord. The landlord sends you their lease and we negotiate from their standard form of lease. Equally, if I write an offer on my Cushman paperwork and send it to most landlords, they're going to take that and transpose it into their own paper and send it back to us. And by virtue of that process, language is going to change. So landlords maintain their position through controlling the paperwork. And the one that no one thinks of is the longer that you're with a landlord, the more they know about you. This makes it harder for you to bluff. And the better your relationship with the current landlord, the more likely you are to take what they've offered you for renewal terms and deal with it with minimal negotiation. Oftentimes I hear, oh, my landlord's my buddy. My landlord says that they're going to give me a great deal. Well, that's exactly what they wanted you to say. To touch on renewals for a second, okay? People often say to me, oh, we just signed our renewal. But look, for all intents and purposes, a renewal is a new deal. Everything essentially is back on the table. The caveat here is some leases and some offers to lease that have renewal options in them contain items that you cannot negotiate at the next renewal. Except for those, everything goes back on the table. So your renewal is your opportunity to renegotiate everything that you can, to set up a new deal that works for your business right now, and essentially create a new governing document that's going to control how your business operates for the next couple of years. So when that renewal comes up and you receive paperwork, don't just think of it as it's just a renewal. Everything can potentially go back on the table. So we've looked at the strong position that landlords have. How do we counter this? Now, this is my job. So I have not been able to condense it into a single slide because it can be really hard to do. And it's why people bring third parties like myself in to do it for them. But again, a short, brief playbook here on what you can do. Number one, please, please, please leave enough time, ideally 9 months or more prior to renewal, to allow you to create what we call a credible threat of relocation, or at least alternative property choices. This is going to show the landlord that you're looking elsewhere and that you have enough time to move. One trick is, send the tenant the renewal paperwork 3 months before expiry. If that happens and you take 2 weeks to look at it, and then 2 weeks to put a response together, and your paperwork lands back with the landlord 8 weeks before your lease expires, they're going to know that you're going to stay. Or at the very least, you're going to renew within their portfolio. So leaving enough time allows you to look at options and to create the credible threat of relocation that wins you back some leverage. Now we're going to talk data. You'll need to get market rents to support or to contest the rent that the landlord has proposed, ideally from 10 or 15 competing properties. And I'll be honest with you guys, if you're not an industry professional, it can be really hard to find this data, but it's absolutely vital. And the data is what you want to present, not emotion. We're not dealing with houses here where we're looking at the color of the kitchen and the carpet on the stairs. You need to keep emotion out of any commercial negotiation. You're then going to want to negotiate your tenant inducements. TI, you can see this referred in leases and to many different acronyms, but this is going to allow you to offset some of that rent. So it could be things like free rental periods, early termination options, leasehold allowances. And again, you have to find that balance. Ideally, you will know the landlord's bottom line. We know the bottom line for every landlord in the city. We work with them so often. And that's going to help you piece this together to say, hey, you can't get that net rent down, but what else can we pack into the deal to offset it to ultimately bring you a sweeter deal? Understand the landlord is likely going to want to keep the net rent high. There's many reasons I won't go into, building valuation being one of them. Landlords love to keep the net rent up. So the majority of plays from a landlord is to keep the net rent a little bit higher, a little closer to their asking rent, and to offset elsewhere with inducement. So don't be surprised if that's something that the landlord wants to do. The last one I didn't originally put in, but kind of thinking about notes for the presentation here, I come across this all the time, so I figured I'd mention it. Don't say to your landlord, give me X, Y, Z, or I'll go elsewhere. It never works. This isn't Kijiji. We're not negotiating whether the sofa should be $75 or 50, okay? And off the back of that, I also want to mention vacancies for landlords. It's important to understand that landlords account and plan for a certain percentage of their units to be vacant at any one time. And they can truck along quite nicely if that vacancy is within their threshold. And the reason I mention it is a fairly common comment from people is, say I'm trying to assist somebody with an offer to lease and it's an office unit and the rent's $15 and the unit's been vacant for 6 months or a year. They'll say to me, well, it's $15, but the unit's vacant. Offer the landlord $4. Tell him, does he want $4 for it or does he want nothing for it? Well, in this case, the landlord wants nothing for it because she or he who owns the property has accounted for vacancy and they don't mind that unit's empty, because what they're going to want to do is hold off 5 months, 8 months, a year, 2 years, and get that tenant who's going to pay closer to the asking net rent and potentially sign a longer term. So just because there's a vacancy and just because a unit's been vacant for a certain period of time doesn't mean that the landlord's going to let it go at a cut rate. And it's, if you're representing yourself in a negotiation, please don't use that as a tool. The next slide, I'm deliberately keeping brief because it's a whole topic in itself, but I just wanted to mention these two beautiful words that rhyme, blend and extend. Very useful to tenants in a tight spot. It's a way of potentially lowering or freezing current rent, even if you're locked into a lease. The compromise being that you're probably going to have to commit to a longer lease term. But talk to your broker about this. I just wanted to put the words on the screen, maybe take a photo of it, blend and extend, because that will be a lifeline to you potentially if you hit a real tight spot. And of course, I'm going to say this, get a broker too, another lifeline. We know the strategies, we do what we do daily, know your landlord very well, how they work. This is all relationships that you can piggyback off. Okay, we're going to get away from numbers and we're going to go beyond the numbers right now to lease clauses, because words can be very costly. The majority of issues I see and the majority of work we do where we have to undo issues with clients comes from people that said, it was just a lease. Well, it's not just a lease. It's a legally binding governing document that in essence dictates how your business is going to run for the entire lease term. And issues with a lease can be costly. They can force expensive eventualities like restoration, termination, relocation. These are things that we see all the time. And thankfully, 90% of these pitfalls can be easily avoidable if you address them at the lease negotiation stage. Because as we've put there, or as I put there, lease terms are somewhat negotiable if you know how. Now, one thing to take away from this presentation is please, please, please always involve a lawyer. So when I look at brokers like myself, we, as I put there, a broker will help too. We can take what we've negotiated in the offer. We can make sure that that is all transposed into the lease. But we cannot give advice on legalities. We cannot give advice on bindability. We won't give advice and can't on things like tax and insurance. So for these, you need to consult with professionals in that field. What we will do when working with a lawyer is, I say, look at the offer, make sure everything's transposed into the lease. Then we will review the lease, go through it, make sure that everything looks standard. We're going to make notes for the lawyer, but then it's going to go to the lawyer to do that actual lease review. The lawyer will send it back with their comments, and then it's the broker's job again to kind of be the go-between and try to negotiate what the lawyer wants with the landlord to get relevant lease terms added, adjusted, omitted, that kind of thing. The price I've given there for a legal review is subjective. It can run the gamut of cost, but as an analogy or as an example, sorry, an $800 lease review could easily save you 10, 100 times that in complications down the road. I unfortunately have had a number of instances since I've been doing this, meeting with tenants who are in a very, very costly position, whether inside or outside of court. And my first question is always, you know, it's all down to the lease. Did you send that lease to a lawyer when you signed it? No, James, no. I gave it a quick flick through over the morning cornflakes or whatever, or my accountant read it and then we signed it. So please, please, please always send a lease to a lawyer for review before you sign it. This is another topic in itself right here. I'm going to burn through them, but these are post-pandemic, call them lease necessities, clauses that you're going to want to have in a lease that are now more important than ever in the climate that we're operating in. So expansion options, we've been through this, they'll help you grow when you're ready without having to pay for that additional space now. Right of first refusal is a really important one, the old ROFA. To boil this down, it pertains to adjacent space. So if you have a unit and the unit next to you is vacant, and you figure you might want it one day, put in the right of first refusal clause. This means that when the landlord, or if the landlord gets an offer on that space, they're going to come to you, or they'll have to come to you first and see if you can match that offer. And if you can match that offer, then you can take the space. And it's really good because it means you're not going to roll off the elevator on some random Thursday and find hammers being swung in the space next to you that you were hoping to take. So that's a really important one. Early termination is something, this has always been important. It's now more important than ever. It could be a one-time option or a floating option. So to put this in real terms, you will sign a 5-year lease and you're not sure if you want the space for 5 years. So you can have, ideally your broker, negotiate in a one-time early termination option at the end of the 3rd year, so month 36. Or it could be a floating option to the effect of, after month 36, you have a one-time option to terminate at any time, say with 6 months written notice to the landlord. Do be aware that this will often come with a penalty. Typically unamortized deal costs and maybe a couple of months rental penalty. This can be negotiable, so please talk to your broker. The next two things that I would suggest getting rid of in a lease relocation would be, to again, put it in real terms, just say you are on a 10,000 square foot floor in an office building. You occupy 2,000 square feet and another tenant occupies 8,000 and they need to expand. The landlord might call on a relocation clause to pull you out to allow them to grow. Now, landlords don't do this lightly because they have expense when they relocate a tenant. Typically, they have to pay reasonable moving costs, fees, and build that new unit for you out to the same, call it configuration, but the same standard of finishes as the one that they're pulling you out of. So landlords don't kind of do this willy-nilly, but I love to try to get rid of relocation clauses to protect my clients. Secondly is restoration. Restoration could be anything, but to some degree would require you to restore your unit to some kind of condition that it was in when you found it. It's something you probably don't want to be stuck with. So it can cause all kinds of issues, from you delaying your vacation from the unit through to the cost of restoration. So work with your broker and your lawyer. These two are really important for lawyers to look at to try to get rid of. The next one I've put in, I've personally not come across this, but doing research and talking to our sisters and brothers with Cushman across North America, we're hearing more of it. If your operations require any kind of specialist sanitization or cleaning requirements that might cause an issue, chemical specific, for example, get these in the lease, pre-agree and pre-fight all of this out with a landlord before, just so it's all buttoned up in the lease and they're not going to hold that against you down the road. The last one will be rent suspension provisions. These can be hard to get, very useful when you can get them, but be aware that any kind of rental suspension is likely going to come with the need to increase the lease term beyond what you originally had planned to, or interest on the deferred amount. There really isn't any way to, for free, suspend or defer rent. So again, talk to your broker and talk to your lawyer. Quick word on force majeure clauses. This would be the most glossed over clause in most leases, primarily because people think, this won't happen to me. It protects both sides against an unforeseen circumstance. You'll see it referred to as an act of God. People actually who are new to commercial leasing have typically seen this in insurance clauses before, the old acts of God. They talk about things like tornadoes and mudslides. I have people joke, alien invasion, that kind of thing. Most leases prior to 2020 did not cover pandemics, and it's caused a whole load of issues. So it's now highly advisable that any future lease, so address this upon your lease expiry, would contain carefully crafted wording to offer protection and provisions against current or future pandemics. Now, it's good to know here that your lawyer likely has pre-written verbiage that they can put in. I'm not going to go into any detail here on what that would be because it's very specific and I'm not a lawyer, but chat to your lawyer about that. When I've dealt with this, as I put underneath, even though many landlords are resistant to it because it typically benefits the tenant more than it benefits the landlord, lawyers have a lot of good wording that they can include. And if you can negotiate it carefully and with good persuasion, then you might be able to get that put in. So as I said, yeah, talk to your broker and always talk to your lawyer. Okay, I'm actually going to go back. I just want to discuss one other thing before I forget. I'm going to leave it on this one. We're discussing lawyers. I would also advise, just thought of this now, I'd always advise people, if they can, if you want to, but if you can, to use a lawyer who is not specialist, but is very used to seeing commercial leases. And the reason being, their hourly rate might be a little higher, but typically they're going to be able to review a commercial lease a lot more efficiently, and the end bill will probably be a little bit less. And of course, cost isn't the only consideration. But some lawyers just see leases all day, and landlords use standard forms, and they've maybe seen that particular landlord's lease hundreds, maybe thousands of times. So any lawyer is, of course, through virtue of their qualifications and experience, able to look at a contract. And at the end of the day, a lease, it boils down to contract law. But a lawyer who is used to seeing commercial leases, I find is very efficient in the process. And I see these guys just pick out things that can give tenants some extra benefits. Let's go back to the slide I just moved away from. It's the playbook. Please screenshot this. It's the summary of everything that we've discussed. Again, it's not comprehensive. This isn't your entire leasing strategy in one slide, but let's recap what we've learned. Design the perfect functional post-pandemic space, get out there, negotiate it with favorable rents, get it packed with inducements, then negotiate a lease that's flexible, it contains everything that we've discussed that's required post-pandemic, make sure it's fair, get your broker and your lawyer to assist you with this. It's really important that you surround yourself with qualified, knowledgeable professionals whose job it is to help you. And throughout the whole process, guys, please leave enough time. And as I said, keep emotions out of it and lean on the data instead. And at the end of the day, then run your business, because nothing that we've discussed today should distract you from running your business. I've seen people lose sleep and lose control of their business's day-to-day operations over something to them that was huge, but ultimately to me was a simple matter that we were able to very amicably and very efficiently solve for them. And it comes down to doctors and mechanics. Our car has this issue, we can't for the life of us figure out what's wrong with it, or a medical issue that we can't figure out, and we worry and we worry and we lose sleep, and then we go to a doctor or we go to a mechanic, and it's something they've seen before, and there's a strategy in place and there's a checklist in place to fix it, and they can do it, and you realize maybe it wasn't such a big deal after all. You need to be running your business at the end of the day. Most leasing issues that are keeping you awake are likely easily solved. I've talked about lawyers. I just want to, continue that division of responsibility by discussing what a broker will do if you engage with one. And this is in the context of a lease renewal. First thing they'll do, they'll review and audit the current lease. They're going to hopefully send you a report of changes that are required either at the expiry or the renewal. These aren't particularly in order, but then they'll engage with the landlord at that right time, hopefully 9 months or so in advance, to start discussing that renewal. At the same time, they'll be gathering data. It can help you make a decision on whether you want to relocate or you want to renew. If you're relocating, whether that relocation is within your landlord's portfolio or if it's outside of their portfolio. Then they will handle the negotiation with the landlord, whether you're staying or going, in your best interests. Review the lease with a lawyer. We've already been through this. Revise it, take the lawyer's markup to a landlord, try to push all of that through so it's accepted, or at least get as much accepted as they can. Then the concierge service, handling all the logistics, the key dates, the timelines, the paperwork. A good broker's calendar is always very, very full, ideally with no space left in it because they're handling all of these little tasks for their clients. And then the last one, more often than not, working with a broker is at no direct expense to you. So landlords factor this in as a landlord's expense. There are some, and by the way, commission rates and fees to brokers are at industry standard rates. We don't just go out there and tell them how much we want for each deal. It's based off a per square foot amount or a percentage of net rent. Now the caveat here, and this isn't official advice from me, is there are situations in which the landlord will not pay the broker. This is something that is ideally going to be a conversation you have with the broker prior, so you will know exactly which situations will trigger that. But more often than not, and hopefully for your sake, the landlord has factored that broker fee in, and the service will come at no direct expense to you. So I think I have either my last but one slide here. This was the pep talk at the end, which is post-pandemic leasing is not a minefield. If you follow what we've discussed here, you're going to be in a great position. In fact, I might say the best possible position to counterbalance your landlord's strong position. It's going to allow you to get affordable, right-sized space with flexibility for growth that's within budget, that has options to grow as your business does. And you'll have a lease that's refined for the new rules with provisions maybe for the lessons and the challenges that we met and had to address as a result of COVID. You'll keep costs low. You'll reduce headaches from an antiquated lease, reduce risk, manage growth, and thrive. And this is what it all boils down to, is being able to run your business and manage risk properly. Because as a business owner, you face risk every day from so many different sources, but your lease shouldn't be something that's keeping you up at night. There's my number. Call or text me, 902-489-0015. Write it down, take a photograph of it. I will always point you in the right direction. I see it as my duty to help everybody who calls me, and you will always get a call back. I practice in a certain area. Good brokers are always selective over who they work with. So my goal would be to deploy my full agency service for you in your best interest and get you the deal that works. But if for some reason I can't do that, and I'll make every effort to, I can guarantee you that I will point you in the right direction. So any questions you get, whether it's now, whether it's later, whether it's a struggle, something keeping you up at night, a curiosity, even if you want to contest something that I've told you today, give me a call, shoot me a text, let's meet up and have coffee. I will always pick up my phone and always get back to you. So that's the presentation. There's my last slide saying questions. I'm going to hand back to Josh. I'll share my screen again. Sorry, I'll put my my camera on again here. Okay, Joe, I'm going to stop sharing. Is that cool?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, James. Such an informative presentation, especially for someone like myself who doesn't really necessarily understand all of the implications of leasing. And so, especially in a post-pandemic.
You're welcome.
So thank you for that. The first question I have for you is, what sort of terms and clauses should I look to avoid if I'm signing a commercial lease?
I think it really comes back to there's many, but the two big ones I'll mention would be the relocation and the restoration. So, we look at things here. There's many eventualities you can face during a lease, but what are the standard things that are likely to come back and bite you? Well, if we can avoid you having to restore a unit at a great time and money expense to yourself at the end of a term, and if we can avoid the chance that the landlord's going to swoop in and want to pick you up and move you again at great disruption to business, we can address that at the beginning of the lease. So there's many, but those are the big two, and they're the reason there that I addressed them in the presentation. I cannot hear you, Josh.
You can't escape it. To the best of us, no matter how many Zoom calls we're in.
No,
But
it's okay.
Next question I had for you was, will the force majeure clause protect me from future global crises like stay-at-home orders or forced closures from government?
It's a very good question. You know, it's subjective. You would have to chat to your lawyer about this. The force majeure clause is designed for protection of unexpected and unavoidable global or local events. But the nuances of if it can protect you from that is something you would need to discuss with a lawyer. What I would tell people is tell the lawyer what's concerning you. That's your chance to do it at the lease negotiation stage, and then lean on the lawyer's advice for some kind of wording that a broker like myself can take and try to negotiate with the landlord. So I'll refrain from giving legal advice there and interpretations because I'm not qualified to, except to say, have an honest conversation with the lawyer and tell them what you're worried about, because those are the guys that can put some potential magic wording together.
Amazing, amazing, thank you. And then another question from the Q&A is how to avoid a personal guarantee on a lease.
Again, talk to your broker. There are ways to get around it. Some landlords will take an increased deposit, but ultimately at the end of the day, the personal guarantee is there to provide some comfort for a landlord, but it might not be the only way that you can provide that comfort. And people don't like personal guarantees. They don't like the idea that personal assets can be tied to their ability to fulfill their lease obligations, and I can completely see why. It's a lot deeper than the basic question being asked and a lot deeper than the answer I'm given. So you'll want to chat through it with a broker and a lawyer. The short answer, without me giving official advice, is to find other ways to build that comfort level in the eyes of the landlord, so the landlord's comfortable going into the lease, to managing the risk that they might think you present, getting rid of that personal guarantee. All I will say is we probably have a 50-50 success rate in terms of getting rid of the personal guarantee versus not. Some landlords just won't do it. What you won't be able to do though is get rid of it and not provide any additional comfort for the landlord. So it comes back to this balancing. A whole world is a balancing act, and yeah, potentially how you can improve your covenant in the eyes of the landlord.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Thank you for that. And is there one more? Nope, I think that's it. And perfect timing. So sadly, folks, we're out of time today, so I am going to have to wrap it up here. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar, and thank you so much, James, for joining us today. Your expertise greatly appreciated. And I have a few announcements for folks that are on the call, so don't run off too early. Be sure to join us for an evening in Wonderland at the HALIFAX Business Awards on April 1st, next week. Can you believe it? And help us celebrate this year's finalists, the finalists for this year's Business Awards. It's going to be an amazing event. One of the first live events of that, I'm sure many of folks have been able to participate in. So it'll be a blast, and you won't want to miss it. You can get tickets for the 2022 HALIFAX Business Awards on our website, halifaxchamber.com/awards. And like I said, with that, live events are back, and we're excited to announce that we're also excited to announce the launch of our 5th annual Wonder Woman conference today. And so that'll be happening May 18th with keynote speaker, the Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould. So a really, really great keynote there. If you're not familiar with her, I definitely encourage you to do your Googles and look her up, as she definitely isn't gonna disappoint. And yeah, the other event I want to tell you all about is our spring dinner happening. We've been doing the spring dinner for over 3 years now, and this year's spotlight is on healthcare breakthroughs happening right here in Halifax. So another really great event, in which you can find on our website, halifaxchamber.com/events. So without further ado, I'll let you all run and get on with the rest of your day and take these insights that James provided us and do your follow-up. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you again, James. It was super informative, very interesting, great presentation.
Take care. Thank you.